Okay, thank you for inviting me, Professor, and welcome students. It's nice to be talking to students again. I've been doing online asynchronous classes for a while, so it's kind of nice to see student faces. Let me just give you a little bit of background to this talk. About a year ago, I launched a podcast series called Retrieving Reason, and I started at ASU just like this, except we were in person. And Professor invited me to come and give a talk. And after that, I made 15 episodes, and I posted them on YouTube and on my podcast platform. But I'm not really sure how many people listen to it. I mean, Reason's kind of not that exciting, but I was hoping more people would listen to it because I think it is really important. And I realized after finishing that series that the way I was going to get people interested in retrieving reason was to show them how and when reason was abandoned. So I'm backtracking now to do that work. I have told part of the story of the abandonment of reason in my 2018 publication, Retrieving Reason, A Socratic Response to Skepticism, but I only spoke a little bit about the history of philosophy in America, and it was really up to the 1950s, not anything contemporary. So I realized I should probably fill in that history because that's really when reason was abandoned in the United States, in the academy. So what I hope to accomplish in this new work called The Abandonment of Reason is to trace the history of epistemology, how do we know, particularly the abandonment of reason from the philosopher Frederick Nietzsche, who dies in 1900, to now. So the history of the past 120 years of philosophy, but I'm really just focusing on reason. Like, how has our relationship to reason changed in the academy over the past 120 years? So I'm going to present an argument, and really what I'm giving you today is an outline of the whole project. So it's going to be brief, but I thought I should spend a little bit of time giving you the argument of the project. So part of philosophy is what I will call, following some Confucian philosophers, the rectification of names. And now to set that up, I'm going to read to you from my book, just to give you a sense of what that is. And I'll read some longish quotes. Thomas Sawes has named the phenomenon of emptying words of meaning semanticide. He says, quote, to concepts like suicide, homicide, and genocide, we should add semanticide, the murder of language. The deliberate or quasi-deliberate misuse of language through hidden metaphor and professional mystification breaks the basic contract between people, namely the tacit agreement on the proper use of words, end quote. The murder of language has a long history and is rooted in an earlier murder of reason, or what I'm calling logicide, the killing of the logos. So in this book, I trace the root of semanticide in the West, and I suggest that Chinese Confucian philosophy recognizes the danger of semanticide and proffers its cure in the rectification of names. And Confucian philosopher Sun Tzu, and that's H-S-U-N, T-S-U, he lived from 310 to 238 before Common Era, so really a long time ago. This is not a new thing. But he says the following about the rectification of names. I'm going to suggest this is part of the job of philosophy. Quote, when sage kings instituted names, the names were fixed actualities distinguished, so identifying and distinguishing. The sage king's principles were carried out and their wills understood. Then the people were carefully led and united. Therefore, the practice of splitting terms and arbitrarily creating names to confuse correct names, thus causing much doubt in people's minds and bringing about much litigation, was called great wickedness. It was a crime, like private manufacturing of credentials and measurements, and therefore the people dared not rely on strange terms created to confuse correct names. Hence, the people were honest. Being honest, they were easily employed. Being easily employed, they achieved results. Since the people dared not rely on strange terms created to confuse correct names, they single-mindedly followed the law and carefully obeyed orders. In this way, the traces of their accomplishments spread. The spreading of traces and the achievement of results are the highest point of good government. This is the result of careful abiding by the conventional meaning of names. So you can see the importance on the meaning of names and naming things correctly. I'm going to continue in this quote. Now the sage kings are dead, and the guarding of names has become lax. Strange terms have arisen, and names and actualities have been confused. As the standard of right and wrong is not clear, even the guardians of law and the teachers of natural principles are in a state of confusion. So you have the proper naming of things on one hand, the rectification of names, or the misnaming of things and confusion on the other hand. So I'm going to suggest that the job of philosophy is to name things correctly. And the opposite of that is called semanticide, or the murder of language. I argue that the biggest epistemological problem of our day is the separation of reason, and by reason I mean the laws of thought. I'll just review those in case you're wondering about them. The laws of thought include the law of identity, which says that A is A, a thing is what it is. The law of non-contradiction, something is not both A and non-A in the same respect and at the same time. And the law of excluded middle, which says that something is either A or it is non-A. So these are reason in itself. So when I use the word reason, that's what I mean. And so when we separate those laws from being what is, then we have a problem. Aristotle discovered these laws, and he writes about them in his book called The Metaphysics, and he says these laws are the laws of being, and we can't separate them. That's important for my argument. If reason does not apply to being, then we cannot know what is. We cannot know what things are. And we cannot name things according to what they are or their natures. We have the condition of semanticide. And if we cannot name things, then words are just about other words in a language game. Language games are legitimized and maintained by power elites. The power elites of our day are the same as those Socrates opposed in his day. They are the Sophists. And that's going to be, the characters of this book are going to be Socrates and the Sophists. In Retrieving Knowledge, on page 11, I'll read one more thing to you. I gave an argument for this book, and it's partly the argument of the new book, so I'm going to read to you. The main argument of this work, Retrieving Knowledge, is that we are currently living through a crisis of public discourse. This crisis is rooted in skepticism, the view that knowledge is not possible. Specifically, skepticism is the view that we cannot have shared knowledge about metaphysics or what is real, and we can't have shared knowledge about ethics or what is the good. The crisis of public discourse is primarily a philosophical problem that requires a philosophical solution. The first era of philosophy began with a search for the logos, or a rational explanation, and ontos, which is the nature of being. So thinking about the nature of being is how philosophy began. The first era of philosophy almost ended with the skepticism of the Sophists, because the first philosophers could not connect logos with ontos given their materialist and empiricist assumptions. Now I'll just fill in what that means really quickly. Materialism is the view that all that exists is matter, and matter is forever in the past, forever in the future. Humans are just material beings. And empiricism is the view that all of our knowledge is through the senses. So seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, touching. So the Sophists are at the end of a period where that was the dominant assumptions. Socrates addresses the assumptions of the first philosophers and the Sophists in Plato's dialogue called the Theaetetus. He argues for a means of connecting logos and ontos. Socrates' conception of reason, we'll call it rationalism, and being, we'll call it realism, is one of the dominant positions in the history of philosophy until the modern period, when moderate empiricism slowly comes to replace Socrates' rationalism. At the end of the modern period, Frederick Nietzsche critiques moderate empiricism and proposes a radical empiricism. So we can't know anything really. And this turns to radical skepticism, and he rejects the Socratic isomorphism or fit between reason and being. Some philosophers following Nietzsche accept this radical empiricism and skepticism and press Nietzsche's assumptions to their logical conclusions. And that's what I'm going to argue we're seeing today. Philosophy as we now know it can either end in pragmatism, everybody just do what works, or philosophers can return to a search for the way in which reason and being are connected, as first philosophy sought to do. And then I argue that Socrates provides a method and example of how philosophy can return to its original search. So that was the argument of this book. But I want to take part of that argument and build a new argument for the new work we're talking about today. In this new project, I want to make the following argument. The post-Nietzschean period of philosophy, so after 1900, has been an abandonment of reason in favor of a new sophism. So as Socrates was facing the sophists of his day, we are currently in a time of the new sophism. The new sophism is based upon critique and is opposed to the constructive use of philosophy, building systems of truth, or what we call metaphysics. It is a nihilistic philosophy that will eventually deconstruct everything, leaving no foundation for philosophy, the academy, culture, or civilization, so says me. We can consider the new sophists in a positive light and say they have replaced thinking about being with thinking about living, which is a conversation I had recently with a friend who studies rhetoric. But have the new sophists provided us with a foundation for living the good life? So we're going to talk about living, but can we talk about living the good life and the good? Can we talk about the common good? If we separate reason from being, we also separate being from the good, which is the driving concept in ethics from Aristotle. We are left without a foundation for metaphysics and ethics. This is detrimental to human life. Therefore, serious philosophers need a rectification of names and a retrieval of reason. What was Socrates doing that was different than the sophists? We need to examine that. Let's attempt to name philosophy correctly. So in Retrieving Knowledge, in that book, I talk about how what goes by the name of philosophy isn't really philosophy. It looks like philosophy, but it's really sophism. So I'm becoming more explicit in naming the philosophers of our day the new sophists. And I'm totally open to critique on this. If you think, no, this is way off, I would love to hear your objections. Okay. I hope you've read The Apology by Plato. If not, this is like a to-do over the weekend. Read The Apology, or you could listen to it. There's an audio version of it on YouTube, I believe. But The Apology was written by Socrates' student Plato. And in The Apology, it's a defense. This is a defense first of Socrates' way of life. He's on trial. His way of life is on trial. He's accused of corrupting the youth of Athens and teaching them gods not sanctioned by the state, or strange gods. And the ones that are bringing this accusation against him are the sophists, and they're represented by the poets, the politicians, and the craftsmen. So keep that in mind. The poets, the politicians, and the craftsmen, because they're going to show up again in our day. And in addition to Socrates defending himself, in this dialogue by Plato, philosophy is also on trial. So philosophy, including the pursuit of knowledge, versus the way of the Sophists, which is skepticism about metaphysics and ethics. So Socrates really thought knowledge was possible, and he spent his life pursuing knowledge of the highest things. What is true, what is good, what is beautiful. So in defining philosophy, I'm going to quickly go over this because I'm hoping you have thought about this a little bit, but philosophy, the way I talk about it is that begins as the search for the logos, and the logos is the reason in us and the understandability of the world, the rational order of things. So there's a fit between our thinking and the world. Philosophy begins with thinkers trying to understand, why is that happening? Why can I think in an ordered way? Laws of thought. There's laws to my thinking. And there are laws in the world, laws of nature. There's a logos in the world that can be understood. Why? So they tried to ground it. And they tried to ground the logos in matter. And it didn't work because matter is always changing. It's constantly in motion. It's in flux. And there's nothing permanent to only matter. And they also saw that we are matter too, and so we are always changing. And if our senses are grasping matter, then we're only sensing change. So how could we really have knowledge of anything if everything is always changing? And so they were looking for something permanent, but they couldn't find it. So Socrates addresses that problem by saying, hey, maybe there's something more than matter. He proposed that there were the forms or the ideas, a realm where there are permanent realities. Now, we don't have to agree with him on that, but it is sort of a way of challenging the assumptions to say, why should we assume only matter exists? Socrates also suggested that humans have a soul in addition to a body. The body is material and it's changing, true, but we have a soul, and our soul is composed of our intellect, our emotions, and our will, or our desires and our will. And that's what makes us human, and that is the permanent part of us. He even went so far as to say that that is eternal. Your soul is eternal and it reincarnates. Again, we don't have to follow him down that road, but we should say he did propose an alternative to the materialism so that the skepticism of his day was countered, had a response. So philosophy is the search for the fit between reason and being. Now, in Philosophy 101, when I teach, I talk about philosophy in 5 different features. It's an area, and as an area of study, it deals with foundational questions in its 3 branches: epistemology, metaphysics, and ethics. And it is dealing with the goal, the good. It's an attitude, and this attitude is the love of wisdom. And Socrates exemplified this attitude. It's a method, and it has to do with the critical use of reason. And this is where we get the idea of critique as part of philosophy. But it's the critical use of reason. So reason, the laws of thought, and reason asking, what does that mean? Identifying and distinguishing, the proper naming of things. So that's part of the method of philosophy. And this is where analysis comes in. Critical thinking. Philosophy is an application, and as an application, it has to do with self-examination. We are applying it to ourselves, looking at our own assumptions, asking ourselves, why do I think that? Do I have good reasons to think that? What are the alternatives? And do the alternatives have better reasons going for them than my views? And am I living according to my views with integrity? So we could talk a lot about application, but it is definitely part of philosophy to not just critique everyone out there, but to do critical analysis of our own views. And then lastly, philosophy is a system. It has to do with a world and life view, which is looking at truth as a whole. And all that claims to be true is not always true. That's why we need the critical use of reason to look at the assumptions of systems of truth. I'm bringing this up mostly because part of the new sophistry is going to reject systems thinking, except maybe for a few. So they're going to reject that we can get to systems of truth. Okay. What is the role of philosophy in the academy? What is the role of the academy? We're all in college right now. What's the purpose of this? Where did it come from? So the academy started by Plato, again, the student of Socrates, and it begins with a method for knowing and pursuit of what can be known. So the academy begins not with skepticism, but with the view that we can have knowledge. And the foundation of the academy is rooted in its providing answers to the foundational questions of philosophy. Questions about how do I know? What is real? What is the good life? So that's the foundation of the academy. And this foundation of the academy grows and it supports the other disciplines. I mean, we're not only doing philosophy in the university, right? We're taking other classes, probably have a major other than philosophy. So philosophy provides foundation for the humanities and the arts, for sciences and technology. I saw a funny meme this week. My friend sent it to me, and it was a guy walking a bunch of dogs, like a dog walker, and he had a belt on, and all the dogs were tied to his belt, and he had philosophy written on him, and all the dogs had all the other disciplines written on them. And it was like, this guy's the anchor for the other disciplines. I thought it was really cute, because it really shows this, that you couldn't have the other disciplines without philosophy. So says Burton, right? All right, so part of the academy is the foundation for educating citizens of the polis, and the polis is the city-state, or the civil government. And the academy is the foundation for culture and civilization. So we were passed on culture and civilization. We were born into what was already there because it was preserved in institutions of culture like family, like state, the government, education, business, religion. These are ways that culture is preserved. So you'll hear me talk about civilization and culture and how they are being challenged right now. And it's challenged right now because the philosophies that undergird them are challenged right now, are being challenged. All right, so we've talked about philosophy. We've talked about the academy. Now we're going to talk about Socrates. Who is Socrates? Why is he important? Socrates wants to know what is. He's a philosopher who wants to know. And he begins with concepts. What is justice? What is beauty? What is the good? He's always asking that question. What is? And the is about being, or concepts. So Socrates wants to know. He begins with defining terms and asking for definitions. Then he goes on to critical analysis of judgments people make. So in the Republic, he's talking to a character, and the character says, justice is what the people in power say. And he says, oh, that's interesting. Prove it. Basically, he says, consider the alternatives. How do we know that's true? So he's doing analysis of arguments. So Socrates kind of gives us a picture of what a philosopher does. And why is his trial important for us today? Well, because the philosopher and philosophy is on trial again today. The majority of people, I'm just going to say the majority of people, are sophists. And I'll tell you what I mean by that. And they're stifling the minority voice who propose an alternative to materialism, to empiricism, skepticism, relativism, pragmatism, sophism. So try to speak out against these things and see what happens. I mean, you can test this empirically. Go and try to talk to your friends and say, I think we can have knowledge. See what happens. And I think our sophistry today, the new sophism, is worse than that of Socrates' day. Why? Because Socrates was in Athens. I'm not sure how influential the sophists were beyond Greece, really. Our sophistry is global. This is like everywhere. And it is supported by big tech. It is supported by big business. And it is enforced by the social media mob. And I'm going to suggest it's dangerous because it threatens our rights and our freedoms, and it threatens the public sphere, that space that we come together and have common discussions. It's very heated right now. And I'm going to suggest it's because we have abandoned reason. And when you don't have reason as a means for common ground for discourse, then we resort to will to power, do it because I said, or emotional manipulation. And those are the two things that the sophists were using to persuade. If you read the Apology, you'll see that Socrates uses reason. He gives really great arguments, but the sophists don't go with reason, and they, in the end, resort to the use of force against Socrates. All right, so who are these sophists? The sophists are, I don't know if we want to call them public intellectuals of some sort, but they inherited skepticism from the previous age of philosophy that was based on the assumptions of material monism and empiricism. So they were born into an age of skepticism like we are. They inherited this from previous philosophers like we have. And they find themselves in the same position we do. They have to get on with living, right? So we have to get a job. I mean, we have to go to college, and we don't have to go to college, but we do go to college so that we can get on with life and, have a decent wage. So they had to get on with the business of living too. And what is good if this is the only life that we have, which is a view that they had? This is it. And we can't really know what is real. We're literally dust in the wind. We're here today, gone tomorrow. So it turns out money and power seem to be the means of obtaining what we want. And maybe some people like power. Some people like money. It gets you further in this world. So we get these desired goods, according to the sophists, through the power of persuasion. It's kind of like become a lawyer or a politician. Now, not all lawyers and politicians are bad, right? So not all sophists are bad, but they're not particularly interested in knowing, being. They're not interested in ideas, and they might even laugh at people who are trying to know things, like Socrates. So they use fine-sounding language to move people emotionally. Does this sound familiar? Maybe they were advertising people, like teaching people how to do advertising to sell things. All right. One good thing, though, that they did do is they developed the art of rhetoric. And when cast in a good light, it is the wise use of words. So they were skilled at language. And this is needed. We all can watch political discourse, political debates, and see, ooh, that wasn't wise, right? So we need the wise use of language. We need good rhetoric. So we can say thank you to the sophists for that. But we don't have to accept the package that they bring in terms of their assumptions. Okay. Epistemologically, the conflict between Socrates and the sophists results in the triumph of reason over empiricism and over skepticism and what I'll call epistemological relativism, that what's true for you is true for you. So reason overcame these things in Socrates' day. Socrates brings philosophy back to the original focus on the question of what is real and how could we know it. Socrates rescued philosophy, the search for the logos, from certain death. The history of philosophy always has this conflict between those who think about being and those who think about living, but it becomes heightened in the modern period of philosophy. So even though Socrates sort of revives philosophy with the use of reason and introduces new categories like spirit and the soul, there will be periods of skepticism in the history of philosophy still. But beginning with the modern period, which I'm going to say starts with René Descartes in about 1649, skepticism comes to the forefront again. And it's because philosophy returns to its old ways of doing empiricism as the method for knowing, rejecting reason, and this results in skepticism always. And this history can be traced. Now, in this work, I will do more detail tracing these philosophers I'm going to mention, but I'm just going to mention that some of the people that move the line from reason applies to being to reason does not apply to being are these characters. William Ockham, Francis Bacon, René Descartes. Now, all three of those may be a little bit controversial to say they move things from reason applies to being to reason does not apply to being, but I will make my case. Further on down the line, John Locke, David Hume, and Immanuel Kant also press things towards the movement of reason does not apply to being. And here's some of the things that may sound familiar to you. There's a problem when Descartes, for instance, says, I think, therefore I am, and that's the thing I know most certainly. Everything else I can doubt. Well, he brings this method of doubt into philosophy and the focus on the individual and individualism and the individual knowing and the individual knowing what's outside of themselves. And this is kind of a new problem philosophy begins to think about. How can we know, how can I as an individual know what is external to my thinking? Can I know the material world? Immanuel Kant also dealt with something like this when he made a distinction between the noumenal realm and the phenomenal realm, where the noumenal is stuff we can't really know through our senses. We could put things like God there, the soul, the ground of morality, but we can't know these things because he still assumes our knowledge is through the senses. So because I can't sense God with my five senses, then I can't really know God. But we need God, so we'll posit God and put him in the noumenal realm. Well, this split between the noumenal and the phenomenal brings a split between what we could know by faith and what we could know down here by our senses. So new problems leading to skepticism. Skepticism about metaphysics. Really, after Kant, metaphysics isn't really done. And that's another piece of this history. But what we do is the scientific method, and a new problem that comes is the scientific method applied universally to everything. It's not just to science now. And this is called positivism, where we do all of the disciplines using the scientific method, so that if we can't know it through the scientific method, it can't be known. This leads to skepticism. Okay, now, what comes at the end of this modern period is Frederick Nietzsche. He's one of my favorites. You should definitely, I don't know if I want to recommend reading Nietzsche at this point in your career, but it's kind of exciting. Maybe exciting in a skepticism way, though. Nietzsche is definitely opposed to Socrates. He aligns himself with the first philosophers who were the materialists, the empiricists. He aligns himself with the philosopher named Heraclitus, the flux theory guy. All is change. I'm going to call, he is the prophet of the new Sophists. He is going to sort of develop the foundation of new Sophists. of the new sophistry. And I'll give you a little bit of what that includes. It's the opposite of Socrates. He's not the anti-Socrates, he's the anti-Plato. Plato wrote down what he understood Socrates to be teaching. All right, so it starts with epistemology. Reason is not ontological. Throughout all of Nietzsche's writings, from the very first writings to his death, he denies that reason applies to being. And he says, reason is a fiction. The laws of thought are a fiction. They're made up by philosophers like Aristotle, like Plato, and they are imposed on the world to order the flux. So this is almost the first version of humans creating the world through language. So it's the beginning of the social construction of language. Reason is a fiction. We made up all of this philosophy to order our lives that are chaos. And he means literally physical chaos. Matter's in flux. So we can't have knowledge of the world, and we can't have knowledge of ourselves, really. All we can have knowledge of is our own perspective. And so he has a view called perspectivalism. The only truth we could know is our own experience. This is very popular right now. It's the basis of standpoint epistemology, and all we have is our own perspective. I can't know your perspective either, so it's very difficult for us to communicate our perspectives to each other. Another piece of philosophy that Nietzsche gives us that we inherit is God is dead, and we killed him. Basically, God was also a category invented by humans to help us get through this life. It also gave us morality, but we are evolved beyond that now. And not just evolved physically, he means evolved philosophically. We now recognize it's a fiction, and we don't need the morality of Christianity in particular, or Plato. So God is dead, we killed him, meaning God is not philosophically or culturally relevant anymore. So we should get rid of God. And we do that by the revaluation of values. So we look at all the values of the past from Plato, which is about, let's say Socrates dies in 399 before Common Era, to Nietzsche, 1900. That's a very long history, almost 2,500 years of philosophy. Nietzsche says it's all false. And all the values of that time period need to be overthrown, deconstructed. Anything reeking of Platonism or Christianity has to go. And one last piece, in ethics, he is called a vitalist, meaning we should just live life. Live life to the fullest. That's the purpose of being here. Live life. And so you can see, again, a return to thinking about living that the Sophists had. Don't do all this philosophical stuff. Just live your life. Now, after Nietzsche dies, I'm convinced not a lot of people would have read Nietzsche except for Martin Heidegger, a fellow German philosopher, starts to promote Nietzsche. He writes 4 books about Nietzsche, and he writes an essay that I have read several times and I find fascinating. It's called On the Word of Nietzsche, the Death of God. And Heidegger goes through the meaning of the death of God. And he talks about, after the death of God, for society, we are left with nihilism, nothingism, meaninglessness. Now, Nietzsche wasn't happy with this. He thought this leads to pessimism, and he thought pessimism was weak, and we shouldn't be weak. He's for the strong person. So Heidegger says in Nietzsche's works you can find 2 kinds of nihilism. The first kind is called negative nihilism. And negative nihilism is where we're critiquing the old values. We're looking for the Platonism, we're looking for the Christianity, and we're calling it out. We're saying that's an old value. That's the slave morality. Get rid of it. But if we only do that, then we're left with nothing. So we have this positive nihilism that Heidegger says Nietzsche proposes. And the positive nihilism is where we will out beyond our values out into the world, beyond ourselves. So we have these values. Maybe it's connected to living life to the fullest. But if each individual person does that, like you live your life for whatever you think is the good, and I live my life for whatever I think is the good, eventually we're going to come into conflict with each other because we'll have a clash of wills. And this is bad. We don't want everyone killing each other. So there's a kind of tendency towards a collective will. And this is a little bit speculative on my part, but I've been thinking about this for about 3 years. And I claim that these new values are willed by the elites, and they're meant to be collective values. And this is perhaps why many people after Nietzsche, although not Nietzsche himself, are either socialists or communists. And socialists, I mean National Socialists like Nazis. Heidegger was part of the Nazi Party. He denounced it later. Or through communists, which are more like universal. They think that communism will be a worldwide event rather than a national event. So many people who are after Nietzsche are also going to be socialists or communists of some sort. And I think it's connected to this willing out new values. And they have to be for everybody. So, okay. The new Sophists come to America is going to be the next thing we talk about. Now, I'm talking about German philosophers. Nietzsche, Heidegger, the German philosophers are so fascinating too. But how did they get here so that now we're talking about German philosophy in the American Academy? This could be really a detailed chapter when I write this, but for now I'm just going to give you a couple points. One is that in America, around 1870, Protestant Christianity was the dominant culture. The Protestants were dominant in the universities. The universities were more like colleges, and they were small, and there were seminaries. And the Protestants were teaching those who wanted to be educated. Well, the German model of the university was adopted in the United States, first by Harvard, and then it grew. And as it grew, it distinguished itself from the Protestant education and became secular. So there's something called the secular revolution in American education around 1870. And I'm going to suggest that this secular revolution paved the way for the death of God in America because it was promoting materialism, empiricism, pragmatism, and the rejection of reason as ontological, and the rejection of metaphysics, because metaphysics is speculation. So they're bringing German assumptions here. And the Christians who dominated the educational system were unprepared for the flood of new ideas coming. They thought, oh yeah, we've got the truth, we're good. And when these other ideas came, it was a challenge that they weren't prepared to meet, and the young people were probably persuaded by it. In addition, from England came Darwinian theory, evolutionary theory, and that seemed to provide an alternative origin story for humans. Okay, what else happens? World War I, World War II. These are terrible human loss. It contributes to skepticism. The Holocaust gives us the question, where is God? And many people turn away from Christianity. And then Nietzsche himself, his teachings, not Nietzsche in person, but his teachings come to America in 3 different ways. One, through the Harvard philosophers who were pragmatists. They brought Nietzsche to their classes. They were teaching Nietzsche. Through the German Frankfurt School, which we're going to talk more about in a moment. And that was in the 1940s. And the French literary critics who come in the 1960s, like Foucault and Derrida. They're all reading Nietzsche. They're all having these assumptions. And it begins to influence American education. So today, we have 3 strains of the new Sophists in America, so says me. And these 3 strains, if you remember the Sophists who were bringing Socrates to trial, they correspond to those groups. So we have the philosophers as scientists, those who followed Immanuel Kant, those who are in the analytic school of philosophy, and they have their version of a critique. They're not doing metaphysics, but they are doing critique. We have the philosophers as poets, who are also doing critique. And these are the literary critics, mostly Derrida and Foucault again, and others in the what we might want to call postmodern camp. And then there's the philosophers as politicians. And they have their version of critique, and it usually is in the social sciences and politics, political science. And this includes figures like Karl Marx, Sigmund Freud, Max Weber, politics, psychology, and sociology. And all of them, except for Marx, were influenced by Nietzsche. Marx is a little bit different, but he's adopted, I think, because of his alternative economic and political theory that is also collective. All right, now let's talk a little bit about critical theory, which is very popular today. I'm calling them the kings of the new sophists. So Nietzsche is the prophet, Heidegger's the priest, and the critical theorists are the kings of the new sophists. Why? Because they're into activism, doing stuff. And this includes the Frankfurt School. This is a group of German philosophers who were communists in Germany in the 1930s. And as National Socialism comes to power, this group is persecuted. So they flee to the United States, and they have, because we have a German model of university now, after 1870, these philosophers find jobs in an ever-growing university system in America. The Frankfurt School finds a home at Columbia University and become very influential there. We are now in the 4th generation of Frankfurt School scholars. Maybe you will be the 5th generation if you carry that teaching out. So what is critical theory? Everybody's talking about it right now. Maybe you're learning about it in your classes. Is critical theory social science? Maybe. Is critical theory a religion? I see people on Facebook, I'm in these groups that are talking about critical theory. It's a new religion. Maybe. Is it an ideology, politics? I don't know, maybe. Or is it a new sophism, a philosophical alternative? I said it was a philosophy. Now I'm saying it's a new sophistry, which is a philosophical alternative. When we don't do philosophy, we do sophistry. All right, let's talk a little bit about some of the features of critical theory, and then I'm going to try to wrap things up. I have more, but I don't want to keep you too long. What is the epistemology of critical theory? So remember, we're talking about how do we know, the rejection of reason, the abandonment of reason. So critical theory continues with the assumption that reason is not ontological. Reason does not apply to being. We cannot know what is real or eternal, but they do affirm we can know some things about reality. So they're a little bit different than, let's say, Nietzsche, who's very radical in his view. We can know some things about reality. We can know that our social reality is made up of identity groups. So we have identity like race, gender, class, gender identity. Okay, and these groups of identities are in an interlocking power struggle. That's just a fact. Power dynamics are a fact. And critical theory would affirm that language is used to create the social reality that we live in and to maintain power. So language is, he who creates the words creates reality, basically. So you could see the rectification of names and the importance of naming things here. The dominant group, or the power elites, are not interested in giving up power. That's a fact. Those in power don't want to give up their power. The dominant group maintains power through oppressing those who are not the dominant group. That's just a fact. And those who are aware of this reality or this truth, this fact, are woke. They're enlightened. They see what's going on, and they should help reverse the power dynamic by calling out those things that are used to maintain power, like the old values, and by giving voice to those in oppressed groups, which would be the new values. So you can see how they're continuing that negative and positive nihilism. So this is being played out first in the university system. I mean, the Frankfurt School comes to Columbia, and they're part of John Dewey's teaching college, and they start to teach teachers who also go into the universities. And it grows in the 1960s when Herbert Marcuse becomes influential to the New Left, and so they get more momentum. And I'm going to say that, and this may be a little bit negative, I love the university. I've lived in the university my whole adult life, but it's become the unity of the diversity of sophistry. And I love philosophy. I learned about philosophy in college, and I see philosophy losing its battle with sophistry. So there's a change from philosophy as foundational in the academy and philosophy as thinking about being. There's a change from education as liberation from our tradition and our assumptions we bring and getting in touch with reality. That's what education used to be about. And the goal now is thinking about living. And usually that's about how to make money and get a good job, or get a good job and make money. Training rather than educating. The goal, as of late, has been activism. The students need to join in this struggle, the power struggle. And extreme pragmatism is the way of the new sophists. And extreme pragmatism turns out to be everything is politics. The politicization of everything. That's a hard word to say. Politicization. I can't say it. So let's talk about everything is politics. If everything is about power dynamics, which is what the new sophists would say, then everything is political. And if everything is political, then nothing is about ideas. And if nothing is about ideas, then there's no room for philosophy. And if there's no room for philosophy, then the sophists ultimately triumph over Socrates. Now, I'm not going to let that happen because I saw Socrates in his day fixed it. Of course, we know how he died, and his students carried it on. Two more little things I want to mention before I wrap this up, and that's technology and big business. These are now becoming the handmaidens of the new sophistry. We've moved outside of the university to teachers just teaching students about critical theory and activism and social justice, to the other elites in society joining. And one of the things that comes from this is that divergent ideas are being silenced. Socrates could be silenced. There's pressure to conform, and there's a call to social activism without really stopping and thinking about it. I'm all about social justice. I really am, but I want people to stop and think about the foundation we're laying, and will that provide justice for society? I don't think the new sophists provide a foundation that will actually bring about justice. All right, so retrieving reason is how I'm going to suggest an end to sophistry and a return to philosophy properly understood. And we can use the challenge of Nietzsche and post-Nietzschean philosophy as an opportunity to address legitimate criticisms, and there are many, against what goes by the name of reason. There are lots of critiques that are legit. And I think we should address those, and we should argue that reason is ontological, which is what I try to do. We should lay a firmer foundation for what reason is and what it is not. And then we should use reason as common ground for addressing other pressing issues, beginning with what is real, what is the good, what is the common good, and what is social justice. So that's my project, and I hope that was actually 15 different topics or chapters or podcast episodes. So I hope, if things go well, I will each week make an episode opening that up in more detail. And then these transcripts I write up will become the basis for a book in the future. So I'm done talking, and I'll pause here.